Are you using a sample piece of dough to monitor your fermentation? It can be a super helpful way to quickly understand what your dough's up to, but is it all it's cracked up to be? Now, one of the most common questions I get here on YouTube and over in our community is why I'm not monitoring my fermentation using a sample piece of dough and what I think about it. Well, I've used this method, I've used it with success, and I've seen it go horribly wrong. So today I'm going to give you my thoughts. Right, so what the hell am I talking about? What is this sample piece of dough? Well, the success, in part anyway, of the sourdough baking process lies in judging the fermentation period correctly. Our dough begins to ferment when we add our sourdough culture, and then it ceases fermentation when we bake it. So our job as the baker is to judge the right moments during the fermentation process to carry out certain tasks like shaping, proving, retarding in the fridge, and of course, baking. We need to do all of this without under or over fermenting or proving our dough. Now, in my mind, there are three ways to judge the fermentation process. You can do it by monitoring the amount the dough increases in volume. You can use a pH meter, or you can go by feel, intuition, experience. Now, monitoring a sample piece of dough is one method we can use to easily see the dough increasing in volume. After you've mixed up your dough, you remove a small piece of it and then you push it down into a see-through container, and then you mark the level where the dough comes up to. That container with the sample is kept next to the main dough under exactly the same conditions. As our dough ferments, it increases in volume. So now we can easily watch our little test subject in the jar, and it's going to be completely undisturbed when we're doing things like stretching and folding the bulk dough. Now, mostly this method is used to gauge the right point to stop the bulk fermentation stage and shape the dough ready for proving in a basket. Recipes often stipulate how much the dough should rise before shaping, 50%, 75% or 100%. So it's easy to see how beneficial this method could be. Now, when this works, it's fantastic. In fact, I chose to use this very method when I was trying to demonstrate how much my dough had risen during my bulk fermentation video. I made my dough and then I removed quite a large sample and I popped it in a jar. I then divided the remaining bulk dough into two and I fermented them separately. When the sample had increased by 50% in volume, I shaped the first dough, and when the sample increased by 100%, I shaped the second dough. Now, in that application, it worked super well, and I'll link to that video below. But here's the issue. While I was filming the B-roll for this video, I used a smaller sample piece of dough. And then towards the end of the fermentation period, I could see a big difference between the two pieces of dough. In fact, my bulk piece was ready to shape, but the small sample, well, it had barely seemed to move or increase in volume. Now, if I'd relied on following the sample, my dough would have been completely over fermented by the time it was ready to bake, and yet both were kept in the same temperature controlled proving chamber, but they behaved completely differently. So possibly the size of the sample piece has a big impact on the accuracy. I know a lot of people in our email community believe that for that very reason, this method isn't 100% accurate. Now, using this method also adds extra steps to the process. You need to remove the sample piece and you need to pop it in a jar. Then at the end of the fermentation, the sample either needs to be added back to the bulk piece of dough before shaping, or it needs to be retained for the next baking session. You've also got another thing to clean up and another thing taking up space on your worktop. Now, if you're baking one loaf, it's probably not so bad, but if I'm baking multiple doughs, it becomes a bit of a royal pain in the backside. It also kind of ruins the flow and rhythm of my baking. It doesn't feel natural to be pushing the dough down into a jar and then watching it to see what's happening. I guess I feel reliant on something I shouldn't really need, but I also feel the same when I'm using a pH meter. And it's not easy to use for recipe design and development. When I'm coming up with a new recipe, I need to be able to touch and feel the dough to understand what's happening. I can't do that by watching the dough alone. But here's the main reason why I think you should very carefully consider how you use this method. If we want to take our sourdough baking to the next level, we need to be able to judge the fermentation process by using our senses. The way the dough feels, the way it smells, the way it looks, and even the way it tastes. Monitoring a piece of dough through a container or in a glass jar teaches us just that, to watch a piece of dough. It's only by touching the dough that we know the best time to shape it. After all, the dough behaves differently depending on so many variables: hydration, flour, and temperature. So it's not always an option to predetermine how much we're going to let that dough rise by. We need to make that decision during the process by continuing to assess our dough. Now, the most accurate way to understand what's happening with our dough is through experience and intuition. And we develop these skills through constant contact with the dough and practicing using all of our senses to read the dough properly. And that's why I think monitoring a sample piece of dough can sabotage our sourdough baking. It places a barrier between us and our dough, which becomes a barrier to improvement. Right, so what's my kind of summary? Well, if you've got this sample method down and it's working for you, you enjoy it, and of course it's producing a cracking loaf of sourdough, then you should continue to use it. But if you're a beginner using it and you're still having problems judging the fermentation period, or of course you want to take your sourdough baking to the next level, you should really move on to monitoring your dough in a big bulk container as soon as you can. Get rid of the little jar. Watching a sample piece of dough only tells us about the volume of the sample. We need to learn how to judge our bulk dough by volume, acidity, the way it behaves, the way it feels, the way it smells, and of course I'm a big advocate for tasting a little bit too. It's when we combine all of these that we have a better chance of reading our dough correctly. This takes practice, there's no getting away from it, but it also means we need to touch our dough, not just watch it. Well, this is only my take. What's your experience? Have you used this method successfully, or have you had problems? Or maybe you've got some other fermentation wizardry up your sleeve. Do let me know. Now don't disappear. I'll see you over in this next video. A huge thank you for watching. I'll see you again very soon. Stay tuned.